Hello and welcome again. Today I'm interviewing somebody very different than I have in the past. Rachel doesn't really have a criminal background. In fact, she was probably on the other side, but she reached out to me months ago working for a national nonprofit and doing really good work. And I just want to tell her story and kind of how her second act is shaped based on her previous experience. So welcome, Rachel.
Thanks, Jesse.
Well,
Thanks
and
for having me on.
as I saw earlier, with the t-shirt, like the brand new t-shirt, looks like you just came out of jail, and the tattoos, all like way too good tattoos for having been in jail. And I saw somebody this morning. This was kind of an emotional thing. As I was going down the street, I saw this guy with the Velcro shoes and the brown pants, and I was just like, oh my God, that was me a year and a half ago. And it just kind of hit me. It was a powerful thing. But yeah, do you want to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background? Because again, you're just fascinating.
Oh, well, I don't know about that. So my name is Rachel Goldstein. I'm a former probation officer, and I still work in this space because I think there's a lot of work we need to do. And now I do consulting work where I still work with probation and parole or community supervision departments and really help them shift their culture so that they can actually help people in the way that they would like to.
True. So how did you get into being a probation officer?
So that's an interesting question, and the story is somewhat long. But growing up, there's this phrase in Hebrew. I grew up Jewish, and there's this phrase in Hebrew called Gimilut Chasadim, which means acts of loving kindness. And this was integral in my growing up. And when I think about the way I was raised, when I was young, I took that quite literally. So acts of loving kindness, it could be opening the door for an old person, or I used to play my violin at old age homes. And so to me, like as a younger person, it was something that was very concrete. When I was in high school, I had the opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. At the time I was living in Chicago, in the suburbs of Chicago. And I spent the summer in D.C. Advocating for education reform. And so I had the opportunity to go in front of chief of staffs of our senators and talk about the importance of education, because growing up, I was always confused how some children got to go to these amazing schools and others did not. And as a kid going to high school, to public high school, that was very confusing to me. And I had the opportunity to go to a school that was very different from mine and to actually see it. And so when I got to Washington, D.C., I was very passionate talking about the education gap. And when I was in Washington, D.C., I was walking through McPherson Square, which is near the U.S. Capitol, and I met a man named Charlie. And Charlie was an individual who spent 20 years in prison.
How old were you at this time?
I was a senior in high school.
Okay.
So I guess a junior going into my senior year of high school. And I met this guy named Charlie in the park, and he told me his story. And first off, I was blown away by how open he was sharing his story. But he had been in prison for 20 years, and he had spent his whole time, he didn't get paroled out. And so when he came out, he really didn't have resources and a support system on the outside. And that was the first time I had met someone who had been directly impacted by the justice system and had served his time and came out and was still really facing the consequences of a mistake he made a long time ago. And again, as a young person, that was very confusing to me. In my mind, he had been convicted of something, he had served his time, but why was he still being punished and stigmatized for something again, that was a mistake and something that happened so long ago? And so that was really a pivotal turning point for me. I had been focused on education, and in part because I think of my age and being in the school systems. But then I was like, this is a group of adults that, again, they serve their time, they come out still stigmatized, and they don't really have the support systems and help that they need to get on their feet. And so that was the beginning of my interest in working with people who have been impacted by the justice system, that then led into me teaching when I got into college at the local jail GED classes. Again, I think education is something that's so empowering, and it's something no one can take away from you. So at the time, that was my way of working with people who wanted to learn more, just generally. And so we did it in a way that was really fun, and we built really a strong group where we felt safe to share and talk about our experiences.
Well, let me ask you this real quick. Probably the best GED tutor that I saw while I was in prison was a guy who used to teach people Shakespeare. And half the time these guys are coming in like barely literate or completely illiterate. And they're like, I don't want to study Shakespeare. Who the F do you think you are? So what were the tricks that you used to really reach people and kind of like open their minds to new possibilities?
Yeah, I think I had a much different approach. I'm definitely not a Shakespeare scholar, or when I read it, I'm like, what does this mean? So I think the way we built a special learning space is really learning about people's lives, where they come from, and what interests them. And based on people's interest was how we kind of chose how we were going to work with people. So it wasn't science-based at all, or evidence-based whatsoever. It was much more, I think, around forming a trusting, good relationship, so that we could then get into some of the stuff that maybe people didn't feel comfortable with. There was also areas, like I've never been good at math, and there was some math that I had to teach that was specific to GED classes. And so just being vulnerable that, like, you can't be good at everything, and there's things in this, if I took the GED today, that I probably wouldn't be able to pass certain sections. So I think just being open and vulnerable, but also hearing where people are at and also where their interests are.
Well, and I love what you say about relational, because we found with our reentry and work with guys in the jail and juveniles in the facility is that it really is that you can have the best evidence-based curriculum in the world, but if you don't have a relationship, nothing is going to change. Nobody's going to be open to it. So that's why everything we've done, we really tried to focus on having relationships first and then focusing on the curriculum or the skills. But so often it's just building a bond, because so many of these kids especially have had somebody come in one time and look at them like a zoo animal and then leave. And they're like, oh, I'm not going to trust this person. Or the people in their lives that were most supposed to be there have disappeared. But just showing up time after time, being consistent, has really created the opportunity for a conversation that wouldn't otherwise exist. So you showing up, by the way, there are a lot of like really idealistic young people, but you actually showed up and you went into the facility day after day or week after week. And that's huge. So I want to commend you for that.
Well, thank you. And I think you're 100% right. I think a lot of times, especially when we get into the professional world, we forget about the importance of relationship building. And I agree, it's pivotal to whatever you're doing. If the relational piece isn't there, whatever else you're trying to do becomes impossible to accomplish. You can have every skill, or like you said, evidence-based practice, but if that trusting rapport isn't established at the get-go, it makes it much harder to accomplish what you guys are, when you're working with people, what you're trying to accomplish together.
I agree. So did you study criminal justice? Was that your major? Or?
No. So I went to this funky, wackadoo liberal arts college. I think there was maybe 1,200 people in the entire school. And I studied sociology with a minor in education policy and social service.
Okay.
I got to really design my curriculum and how I wanted to do things, which was really nice. And that's, I think, the benefit of going to a small college is they really see you for the individual instead of being one more person. And so at a school that size, when you think about wanting to have a sports team or an orchestra or band, you really have to handpick the people you're bringing in each year, or you might not be able to have those extracurricular activities that are so important when you go to school, and to have those experiences that are outside of the classroom.
Well, and you mentioned playing violin. Were you in orchestra? Did you play sports?
Yeah, so I was never a sports person. I was a wannabe for sure. So in my family, along with when we started talking, Gimme Lut Hasadim, acts of loving kindness, I would say another integral requirement and something that was important in my family was music. And so it was a requirement that my brother and I started playing an instrument at the age of 4, and we had to choose, and we didn't have a lot of choice. It was, I think, violin, viola, or piano, and I chose the violin. And so it was something that my dad, because at 4 years old, you can't practice anything on your own. It was something that we did together every day. And if I didn't do it, there were consequences, whether it was my dessert privileges being taken away or not being able to go play with friends. So there was a lot of temper tantrums, but I also, about the age of 13, started realizing the benefit of sticking to something. I actually started making money from violin. I started teaching.
Wow.
I started playing at weddings and bar and bat mitzvahs. And so it actually became my source of income starting at age 13 all the way through college. So I was very appreciative of my father ensuring that I practice something every day to get better. And you know, when we talk about practicing, I think in this day and age, there's a lot of pressure on us to be perfect. And practice doesn't equal perfection whatsoever, but it does equal progress. And it also creates habits that can be transferred into other areas of your life. And so for that, I'm very appreciative.
And that's huge because one of the things somebody told me inside that I'd never thought about is you have to learn how to learn something. Like it doesn't matter what it is, but until you actually learn how to like really dig in and deal with the struggle and deal with the setbacks and learn something, you're never going to be able to learn anything. That was one of my issues is like every time something got hard, I was like, oh, I guess this isn't for me, rather than pushing through and really getting there. So when we talk about people who are coming from backgrounds, whether they had, you know, kind of whole family units or not, where that wasn't emphasized. I mean, you started life with a very different model and a very different kind of drive than other people did, just because of that support and that encouragement or that carrot and stick with the dessert. And that just sounds amazing.
Yeah, and what I'll say too is there is a philosophy that came along with this type. I played Suzuki violin, and Shizuke Suzuki was a Japanese musician and teacher that had this philosophy that every child can learn to play an instrument, but they had to have this very specific support system in place. So it was this triangle where you had, you know, the individual learning the instrument, the child, you had the support system, which was like someone in your family that could help you day to day with the practice, and then your community within your musical community, which included your teacher who would teach you the techniques. But then every other Saturday, I would go play with kids who were at the same level as me. And so there was that community component where every other week I got to go play for 2 hours and to also listen to other people perform. And so it really created this community for me that I grew up in. And these kids I played from the age of 4 all the way up until my family moved away. And I got to travel the world with these people. When I was 16, I had the opportunity to go to Italy, and we got to play at a World Suzuki convention with other kids from all over the world. And although we couldn't speak the same language, we could through our music, and we would play the same pieces of music. And that's how we connected. And so that was a very powerful moment when it comes to community, and also that all these other kids had that support system, and then that we could come together and speak a common language.
It's amazing. So you've talked about, you know, advocating for education reform and volunteering and music. Like, were you ever a bad kid? Did you ever get in trouble?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And I think that's like really important to bring up, especially when we're talking about in the context of our criminal legal system. I think humans are designed to be imperfect. And there's just certain things that our society and culture have deemed step over the line. But I would argue that we all do bad things. We all make mistakes. We all have skeletons in our closet that we're not proud of. And I can honestly say, like, if you ask me what those are, I would say I'm not sharing that today.
Yeah.
Now, some of us don't have that privilege because if you're convicted in a court of law, like you've been caught and you have to openly admit if you're found guilty or if you choose to admit guilt. And so I think that's something that's really that I struggle with, because as humans, like, we do make mistakes, and the times that we do things we're not proud of are usually pivotal moments in deciding next steps and how we want to handle something, because we can choose to do something differently.
Yeah, and I just think about the shame component that goes with that. That people, feel trapped by their secrets, and in some cases, it may be something they'd never been caught for, or never had to deal with the consequences of. But I met with somebody last week who was on a presentation that I did, who came to me and said, "Hey, there are only 11 people in the world that know this." He said, "But I was in prison," and it blew my mind because he literally went to prison for speeding tickets under the old habitual offender law. As a college student, as a great kid, he got speeding tickets, and he was a habitual offender, and he had to go to prison. And he was in law school when they finally caught up with him. We're like, "Hey, sorry, we got to take you in." And I just remember being like enraged by that. Like, this kid got a couple speeding tickets in his like crappy car that was barely running, and you're going to stick him in prison. And now for years, he didn't tell anybody. He never finished law school. He never applied at a big corporation because he figured they would never give him a chance. And he cried when he filled out the last application for the job because it asked about a criminal background. He said, "Man, I'm never going to be able to give the life to my kids." This is somebody who served in the military, who like did everything right, and yet is still haunted by this past. And so many years later is still ashamed and is only told now 12 people, which just blows my mind. So you talk about
that's devastating to hear. And I think, again, like, I've worked with a lot of people who have been convicted of different types of crimes, both at the county and federal level. And I see that all the time, the shame or the fear of, the what ifs that come with having a conviction, and worrying about how other people will see that. And it's like always this skeleton that is so still impactful even after being released and fulfilling all the obligations that were asked by the court. And that's devastating, I think, not just for the individual and their families, but society as a whole.
Absolutely. So what is the path from college and the sociology degree and the activism to being a probation officer?
Yeah, so when I was in college and thinking about, okay, if this is the population I really want to serve, what does that look like in a professional way? And I contemplated going to law school. I contemplated getting being a licensed social worker. And as I was looking at the different paths, I was struggling. I didn't really want to go to law school because I didn't see myself advocating in the way where I wanted to be a public defender, or I wanted to do something that I felt was more with the people and not something that had to involve like going to court every day, which probation work, sometimes you do have to do that. I think too, with the social work aspect, there was this sense of, and just like going to law school, more schooling, more debt, and you come out and you don't really make a lot of money unless you're in private practice. Or so I think I was concerned about that. I also had a great grandfather who lived during the Depression, and he worked for the federal government making ammunition at the time up in Aberdeen, Maryland. And I was lucky enough to have him in my life until he was 98 years old and I was 17, which is very rare. And he always told me, like, work for the federal government, they'll take care of you. And so I think always in the back of my mind, like we talk about, growing up, I was a violinist. There was at one point a time where I thought I was going to be a professional violinist. And then deep down, I'm a very practical person. And I think I got freaked out because I didn't want to teach. And so if I didn't want to teach, that meant that I would have to make a living from performing, which isn't necessarily the safest, most secure job. And so I think that freaked me out a little bit. And so I think, wanted to work for the government. I think in part because it's serving the public, like it is there to serve the public. I don't think at the time I had an understanding of all the things that happened behind the scenes. But when I was 19, I had an internship at the local probation department near where my family was living at the time. And I got to do intakes. So I got to gather information from people that were just coming onto probation. A lot of them hadn't served prison time per se, but maybe spent a couple days in the local jail and then were sentenced to probation. And when I started interviewing people and learning about their lives, I was so fascinated. I wanted to learn more. I had such an interest just to understand how people end up where they do. And I loved getting to spend my time getting to know people. And although I didn't get to be their probation officer after, they would then move on to an actual officer. I realized that I loved doing probation work. And so that was, again, I was a sophomore in college, and that was the beginning, I guess. And I ended up graduating college a year early, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I decided to participate in AmeriCorps for a year. And I don't know if people know what that is, but it's basically serving your country for a year as a volunteer. You get a very small stipend. I believe it's like $800 a month to live on. But in the end, once you complete the year of service, you get money towards future education or paying off student loans. And so I moved to Rochester, New York, and worked at the Rochester Police Department as a victim advocate. So anybody that was identified as a victim of a crime, I would reach out to and help them through the court process. So that was a very unique experience. And it was also the first time I'd really been out on my own, and not making enough money really to survive. And so really had to, like, I remember my rent was $675 and I brought home $800 a month. And so I applied for food stamps, and I picked up some jobs at the local Hebrew school, teaching Hebrew on Sunday mornings and nannying in the afternoons, and working, 12 to 14-hour days. And I think that was, for me, very humbling, but also like the reality of starting to become an adult. And so I did that for a year, and then was hired on at the local probation department where I had done my internship a couple of years earlier. And then that was the beginning of my government career.
Okay. Well, and you talked about you wanting a job that was with people or with the population you wanted to work with, and that it was a public service. Was that the experience you found, or the culture you found when you started there?
Unfortunately, no. I think, again, when you hear my story, I would say my values were deeply rooted in social justice and public service motivation, wanting to help people through the public sector. And I think what I realized when I actually got to doing the work full time, that it didn't necessarily align with the values that I came in with. And I also think what happened for me specifically is I'm a people pleaser. And so I think I morphed into the culture that existed to fit in and to be seen as doing a good job. And I think when you're young, that can happen more easily. Just because you're new and being a professional, and you're trying to make money and support yourself. And I would try to find ways within that to get back to my values. But I think overall, my mindset and the culture I was working in was shifting how I was carrying out my work.
Okay. And I think that's really important when we talk about systemic issues, because you went in as the best intentioned, idealistic young person with all the motivation in the world to help. And like you said, it kind of corrupted your values, or pulled you away from that. So do you think that the change has to happen from within? Is it just individuals being charismatic enough to change the culture? Or is there some kind of culture change that happens to happen from without, either accountability or oversight? Or what do you think that looks like?
Yeah, I think it has to be a mixture of both. I don't think that one or two people or even a group of people within an organization can create culture change. I think the organization has to be bought in as well. I mean, people make up the culture, right? Organizations don't exist without people, but systems were designed to get the outcomes they get, and they weren't created to change. Like, they were built to carry out specific things. And when we think about some of the systemic barriers that exist in our culture, that's why there's still inequity in sentencing. There's more Black and brown people that are being convicted and imprisoned. And that's because our system was designed that way. And so there are systemic things that have to be addressed if we want to move our system forward and for it to be more equitable.
Okay. So how long were you a probation officer, federal probation officer?
Yeah, so I started in the county. I was there, a county officer, about, I don't know, a little under 2 years. And then I had the opportunity to go to federal probation. And I was excited about that for numerous reasons. I think in part, like, it was seen as the big leagues, at least to me at the time. And so I entered federal service in about 2014, and was an officer until about 2019. And that's when I transitioned into more of an administrative role with the government. But I was actually serving as a probation officer for a good 5 to 6 years at the federal level.
Okay. And did you find, because you've talked about the culture and the issue, did you find really good people doing good work? Did you find people fighting against the system, or did you find people that had kind of fallen in line with that people-pleasing tendency?
I think it was a mixture of both. I think like the people that I identified with and were close with were people that were trying to make change, but within the system that currently existed. So to do it, but still constrained in a way. And I'll give you an example. So over the past 30 years in criminal justice research, there's been a lot of evidence-based practices that have come to the surface. And if you do X, Y, and Z, people are less likely to reoffend if you help them with these things.
Sure.
One of them is having a risk assessment that identifies criminal behavior or criminal, it's focused on criminal behavior, right? Things that mitigate, that you're trying to mitigate. So like areas like how you think about things, who you hang out with. And so there's been all this research that has come out. But again, there's been a lack of understanding of what actually happens in practice and how the system is designed. And so sometimes, like, we would be trained in these practices, but then it wouldn't be a part of our performance evaluation. It wouldn't be a part of, it wouldn't align. And so that's confusing when you're in this position where you're supposed to be helping people, but you're also supposed to be enforcing a court order of conditions that you didn't have necessarily a choice in picking. A lot of times there's standard conditions. So there's conditions that apply to people that aren't even based on their situation or things that were involved in their case. And so I think, and a lot of them are arbitrary and there's no evidence behind. And so I think, again, there's like, you're put in this situation, or at least I felt, I can't speak for everyone, of course, but I just felt like I was set up to fail in doing my job to help people. And so I think it came to a pivotal point where I was like, I can't do this anymore. This isn't working. And I had the opportunity to go work as an administrator at our oversight office or national support office. And I was like, oh, maybe I can make change there, because now, I could be a part of maybe system change. And I realized really quickly that because of all the bureaucracy and all the systems in place, that was going to be pretty impossible to do. And I think that was devastating. Because again, I think there's a lot of good people. I've worked with a lot of passionate, great people that want to see the change. But to change systems is very difficult.
Yeah. Well, you talk about you feel like you were set up to fail. Do you ever feel like the probation requirements are setting people up to fail?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it, like, just one day you're on supervision and one day you're not. So, like, one day you're going to court, you get sentenced, and then all of a sudden you walk into your probation officer's door and you have 20 rules that you're supposed to follow. Some might be really easy, but some are like sometimes counterintuitive. Like, in some counties, you're not allowed to leave the county without permission. Well, what if you have kids or like family members that live a county over? And like one day you have to follow these rules when yesterday you didn't have to. Like, that can be really difficult to grapple with. And I think there's this sense that like once you're on probation and you get those rules read to you, that you're like automatically expected to change your life to adhere to these rules. Again, some are completely arbitrary and like, where are they coming from? And so I think like if I put myself in other people's shoes, I'm like, that would be awful. Like, I wouldn't be able to do that. And I know that there would be workarounds that I would try to put in place so that I could, do certain things that I deem important to my values or things that I need to do to survive.
Yeah, well, that was like one that I ran into because the probation districts in Virginia are, like you said, very arbitrary. They're designed. So I happened to, because of where I was living, be in a district that was actually far to the west of me. But where I worked was to the east of me, and I was right on the edge of the boundary. So technically, I needed permission every time I left this radius. And so I went to my PO and said, hey, first of all, you haven't talked to me. I've been out for 2 weeks. It's the first time you're telling me. You're telling me I've been required to do these things from day one and that I've been in violation every day that I've gone to work. But hey, like, what do I need to do? How can I get this approved? He was like, oh, just don't worry about it. Right. I was like, no, don't worry about the thing that's going to send me back to prison. Like, that doesn't feel like a very responsible, like, helpful approach. He goes, oh, well, just don't cause any trouble and it won't be a problem. Like, no, that's not supportive. Like, that's not encouraging. That's not even allowing me to follow the rules. You're just telling me to ignore a rule that could potentially violate me.
Yeah, and I think that's like also the interesting and also can be the scary thing about probation is the variability, right? There's discretion usually that's given within a condition because it will usually say like to the discretion of your probation officer, which in some ways is really good and in some ways is not, because like you're dealt the hand you get, and there's some really good probation officers out there and there's some really bad ones. And so I think who you end up getting as a probation officer or parole officer, there's so much variability in how they can respond to something that's happening. So like, for example, it sounds like your officer like was like, oh, it's no big deal as long as you don't get in trouble, but you're like reading the rules and you're like, but I want to make sure that I'm doing everything the right way. And so that discretion sometimes actually makes it more difficult, but it also means that people can be treated differently or unfairly. And so I think there's a lot of responsibility that comes with being an officer. And again, going back to like, I don't think it's something where it's like you should have automatic authority, but rather like you're building a relationship with the people you're working with to be able to hold them accountable, not because you're in the role you're in, but because you truly care about seeing someone succeed. And therefore, the accountability piece becomes something that the person you're working with wants, like the relationship is there. And so it becomes more about this working relationship versus this power dynamic between like, you're the PO, I'm a person on supervision. And I think if that is how it's set up, like where the power differentials are there and it's not something more collaborative, then it makes it really hard in general for it to be a successful relationship, which also usually means that the person on supervision is potentially going to have more issues.
So I know the federal system is a lot better resourced than at least our local probation parole. Did you have access to the resources to really direct people or help people get the services or help or training or whatever they needed to succeed?
No. So the reason I say that is, yes, the federal government is better funded in terms of maybe being able to provide contract treatment services or to pay for things, but that doesn't close the gap of things that are just truly missing. I'll give you an example. this happened all the time. Let's talk about substance use for a moment. There's very few detox facilities or enough beds for inpatient treatment that are affordable. And so there were many times in my career where I had a person I was working with who had a substance use issue, and they were actively using and seen as a danger because maybe they had a child they were caring for, or maybe they were driving under the influence and admitted to that or called me when it was happening. And I was put in a tough situation because if there were no beds available at our go-to places, I would have to write a warrant. And that, like, putting someone in jail temporarily to detox or to get them into a safe location is unacceptable to me as a human, as another human being, because that's not helping anything. But we still don't have the resources. At least I've never seen a place that always has availability to get people into a treatment program. If they want to go. I mean, if they don't, that's a different discussion. But I think to put someone in jail because we have nowhere to put them is just problematic.
Well, I think about that just as a larger, not even safety net, but just like social services. One of the things I had to do for probation parole was get a mental health evaluation. And when I contacted the community service board, there was a 6-month waiting list. And my PA was like, no, we need that now. So I don't know that they would have violated me. They didn't threaten me, but I had to go and I paid for an evaluation that I then took to them. I said, okay, you're fine to go. But we had somebody in crisis involved in our reentry program recently and just in desperate need of mental health care. And we reached out, and the only place we could find that wasn't like $500 out of pocket immediately was a 3-month waiting list. And when we don't have the services, we can't get people into treatment, can't get a mental health care or even support. It really is a question of like, how do we expect people to succeed? And not just people who are on probation, but just people in general.
Yeah, for sure. And it's sad too, because a lot of times when people are on some sort of supervision, we can get them in faster than if someone who's not, especially like when it's an affordable program or state-run program. But again, it's to me, it's backwards. Like that, like social services and those types of crisis services need to be available for anyone and everyone who needs them.
I agree. All right. So you move to an administrative role, you're disillusioned with the system. Where do you go? What do you do after that?
Yeah, that's a great question. While I was in that role, I had great opportunities to continue learning and growing and learning about implementation, which I'm gonna nerd out for a second, but I always was so confused. Like we have all these great evidence-based practices that we say work and that can help people, but they're never implemented well. And I didn't know that there was a whole science about how to implement these practices well and with fidelity, which means to their intended, how to be used as they were intended. And so I was introduced to active implementation frameworks and how you build capacity and infrastructure within an organization to support whatever change you're trying to make. So after I was starting to get ready to leave the government. And I think I always explain this to people, and it's a very bizarre phenomenon that even people that are working within the system are part of it in a sense and feel trapped in a sense. And what I mean by that is if you ask any federal probation officer to introduce themselves, this is what they'll say. My name is Rachel Goldstein. I've been a probation officer for 5 years. I have 25 years, 2 days, and 3 hours left until I can retire.
Yeah.
We all kind of laugh, but it's actually really sad to hear that, the retirement piece. Because if you're counting down the days till retirement, that probably means something's lacking in missing for you in your career. And these careers are very stressful. I mean, you are on call 24 hours a day. You're hearing everyday people's problems, their crisis moments, and again, I do think genuinely people get into the profession to help people. But like I say, I think with the misalignment that happens once you're working in this system, that there's you help to try to bring that alignment for yourself as a worker. So anyway, I was at the point where I'm like, I've been in the system working almost 10 years. I kind of have to make this choice. Like, if I stay much longer, it's going to be harder to leave in the future because of benefits and early retirement and things of that nature. So I decided to start looking, and I had an opportunity. A position was created for me at an advocacy organization that focused on probation and parole reform, and to do implementation work. So I was like, this is my opportunity to jump and to do something different that I've never done before. So I left. But what was great is that I still engage and get to work with people that work in the system, so we can continue to problem solve ways that we can try to overhaul our system to be more effective.
Okay. So in that role, do you feel like you're released from the constraints of working within the system? And are you able to, or have you been able to make an impact on the system as a whole?
Me as an individual, no, because I don't think, I mean, one individual is not enough to do that type of work. It takes a group of us. It takes us coming together, not just me as someone who's worked in the system, but also having the perspective of people that have been in the system, their families, our communities. This is much bigger. I think when we think about the justice system, like, we haven't done a great job of connecting with other social service agencies and really coming together to problem solve versus us individually, like probation and parole, human services, healthcare. Like, we need to come together to have a plan that's going to be integrated and better serve the community as a whole versus us trying to individually in our silos come up with solutions. I don't think it's going to work that way. I do feel like I have a lot more freedom to be creative in coming up with solutions that internally I couldn't do. But I can now bring people to the conversation from all these different entities and have a sit down and brainstorm and start thinking about solutions that can really, again, help systemically change the way our system has functioned, which is hard to do. But I think I do have hope that we can get there with consistency and collaboration.
Well, and that was one of the things that impressed me so much about you is when you first reached out, you reached out with an offer of help, but also to ask for my perspective and say, hey, I think this would better inform the conversations we're having. We can improve things if we look at it this way. And you're one of the only people that I've talked to who's done that, because there tend to be, even in the reform movement and the kind of like justice reform movement, this idea of like our way or your way and nothing in between. And it's like, okay, if you're only talking to people who've been out of prison, like, well, let's talk about the challenges to implement the things that would actually make services better. Like, let's have a conversation as a whole. Like, this afternoon, I'm going to meet with the Commonwealth's attorney, which is a really strange thing for me to be like, yeah, they're inviting me to the office to go hang out. But what I found so important is talking to everybody involved and finding out where our common goals or our common kind of values are, and then how can we work together toward them. So I really appreciate that about you.
Well, I thank you. That means a lot. And I think you said something important. You know, when we talk about change efforts, whether it's legislatively, I think a lot of times we think we can get behind a movement and make change. I will say that coming together, like, that's number one, right? Like, we have to have power in numbers, but just because a law changes doesn't mean that the system is going to change. It doesn't mean it's going to be, again, implemented well. Like, we have hopes that it will, but who's accountable for tracking the accountability? If it's not in the bill, guess what? It's probably not going to happen. I think then we go to understanding that even if things don't change legislatively, or even if they do, that's not enough. We still have to come together as a community and like being part of humanity to say, like, what do we want to see different in our communities, and how can we work together again to like bring these siloed entities? There's all this money and funding and direct service work happening. Like, let's come together and like be more powerful as a unit versus trying to each do our own thing, because we are so much more powerful together. And I think too, when you actually get to talk to people, like one thing I don't like about our system is like this othering type thing. Like, I'm the officer and like they're the offender. Like, when I hear that word offender, it like makes me like, I have a physical reaction to it. We're othering, and that's like, that's not right. And I can sit here and say I've made many mistakes in my life. I'm just lucky enough that I didn't get caught, or I didn't end up in a situation. And so I think we have to, again, like, the humanity, the human piece of this is like, we all just want to be accepted by others. We want to fit into a group, like our desired identity group, whatever that is. And I think we need to work with each other to help us get there. And that's the beauty of really just listening, being an active listener, and not going in knowing all the answers, because none of us do, but rather listening to what people are saying and then working together to co-design solutions. And even if those solutions don't work, that's okay. But like, let's continuously try new things, and I call them improvement cycles, but have these cycles where we're trying new strategies and see what sticks, and what's going to work in this community, because it might not work over here. But how can we work together to create whatever we're trying to accomplish together?
Okay. Well, in that vein, do you want to talk about any of the recent work you're doing, or is it all on the down low or hush?
No, it's not on the down low. So I currently work for a consulting firm, a government consulting firm. So we work with probation, parole departments, many times through grants. But I'm very lucky to work alongside of people that have a similar mindset as me in terms of how to approach this work. And so really what we're doing now is focusing on this idea of probation offices, departments being more coach-like. And so again, as we talk about how we treat people or how we approach the work, like when you think about the people that have made the biggest impact in your life, they're not referees or people that monitor compliance. They are people that provide you support, feedback, and really invest in you, as whether it's a player or, you know, a violin player, a sports player, whomever it is, that someone is invested in your success. And so really what this project aims to do is to shift not only the mindset of the officer, of the people doing the work, but the organization as a whole. And that the organization sees its function as helping people become their best selves. A lot of times in probation and parole work, it's been very focused on how to mitigate criminal behavior, which might be part of it in some aspects, but we have to look at people as a whole. Like, they have things they're trying to accomplish or to try to learn. And so seeing them as a whole person and what they're trying, like where they see their desired identity or what groups of people they want to identify with, that the officer or the coach is helping them get there. And so really we have the opportunity to not only implement this, but evaluate what happens in practice and what we see as kind of the core components of what needs to be there to create this coaching organization.
Okay. Well, for most of the time when I talk to people about their second chance or their second act, it really is kind of a hero's journey, like going on this perilous thing against major forces. And it sounds like that's exactly what you're doing. So I wish you the best of luck in that front.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, again, I don't do it alone. I try to surround myself with people that have knowledge and expertise in areas I don't, because again, I can't combat this on my own. But I will say that it always goes back to my personal values around social justice and remembering that people's values and motivators are all different, but that I have learned through the process of staying true to my values and my worth and understanding that. And I think for people who have been impacted, that's always important to remember too, especially when you feel that, whether it's imposter syndrome or like lingering worry about convictions or things of that nature, that you remember your worth. Like nothing, you're born with that. Nothing, nobody and no one can take that away. And so I think it's just remaining true to who you are and who you're also hoping to be as you continue to learn and grow.
I love that you say that. And that's the coaching mentality, because getting out, I deal with all that, imposter syndrome, not feeling like I'm worth it. And I had two people in particular who insisted on taking me out to like really nice dinners and really nice places. And I would say, no, we can't do this. And like, no, but we've got to, they said, no, you're worth it. And that were both of their words. So this past week, or actually 2 weeks ago now, when we had one of the juveniles furloughed, I took him to the fanciest lunch I could find. And he was like, man, I don't know what any of this is. Like, what is this stuff on the menu? I was like, look, ask for what you want, ask for any questions you have. And at the end, he said, why did you do that? Like, why did you take me there? What was the plan? I said, because I want you to know that you're worth it. You deserve to have these experiences. And I know how impactful that was for me. And I hope to have that for other people. And then to have someone who is in a position of authority, who is working with those in authority, to be carrying that same message, I just think is so vital. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me. And I wish you all the future success in the world. And I hope we can work together on changing projects and changing the system and making things better.
We will, Jesse. We will. I know I will find ways to continuously try to work with you. I think you add so much value in your positivity and experience. You just have so much to give to others and humanity as a whole. So thank you for everything you do.
Thank you, Rachel.